Yesterday, on the 6th of May, people around the world watched as Britain celebrated the coronation of their new king, Charles III. But where did the British coronation ceremony even come from? What was the original purpose of it? And how has that purpose changed over time? Long before Britain became the United Kingdom, it was split into England, Scotland, Ireland and Wales. A crowning of the legitimate ruler became necessary in order to maintain stability when there was more than one claimant for the throne. Not that this always prevented conflict. In England, the very first ceremony was performed with King Edgar on the 11th of May 973, whose coronation was also known for his wife Aelfthryth becoming the first crowned queen consort. It is possible that Edgar, who had by 973 been king for 14 years, was crowned in a simpler ceremony at the beginning of his reign, but all versions of the Anglo-Saxon Chronicle appear to infer it was a first ceremony, with some of them calling him Aetheling Edgar, indicating he wasn't yet a full king. Edgar's coronation took place at Bath, not Westminster as it would later be. In the Anglo-Saxon period, no single city had yet been established as a capital of England, and the monarch would move around with his family and retinue through his kingdom at least 4 or 5 times a year. It's not certain exactly where the ceremony was held, but it's likely to have been at the monastery that once stood on the site of the current Bath Abbey. Other Anglo-Saxon rulers had ceremonial crown-wearing events, such as at Christmas and Easter, but Edgar's coronation seems to have been the first time the king's authority was linked in with the religious connotations of being chosen by God and working alongside the church. It was also the first time an oath was taken as part of the ceremony, a promise between the monarch and the ordinary folk of England. The significance of this was also to help cement the idea that he was the ordained king to rule the country, and as a result, so were his children. The ceremony itself was drawn up by St. Dunstan, Archbishop of Canterbury, and was likely influenced by the coronations he had seen taking place amongst Frankish kings, as well as ceremonies used in the ordination of bishops. The timing would change with future coronations, however. Although Edgar waited 15 years for his crowning, later kings sought a speedier ceremony. Harold II was crowned the day after being declared king, a reflection on the uncertainty of his claim to the throne. It wouldn't be until William the Conqueror that a fixed place would be chosen. His ceremony took place on Christmas Day in 1066, adding a sense of divine rule to the proceedings, and reminding those watching that he was chosen by God to lead the country. But more importantly was the choice of venue, Westminster Abbey. William had invaded England in order to take the English crown promised to him by Edward the Confessor, removing the Anglo-Saxon Harold II at the Battle of Hastings, who claimed to have been given it on Edward's deathbed. William, as a Norman duke from across the Channel, had to remind everyone of his links to his cousin Edward. Earlier in the 1040s, King Edward had created a new royal residence for himself on the banks of the River Thames, close to the present-day Palace of Westminster. A nearby Benedictine monastery was enlarged, becoming known as Westminster. Edward was then buried there, and so the entire abbey had connotations of being connected with the previous undisputed king, strengthening William's claim. William was also the first monarch to spend the night before his coronation at Westminster, a tradition that remained until the mid-19th century. Also important was the combining for the first time of government, religion and the monarchy. In England, unlike in Normandy, succession was still not based on inheritance. William would bring this idea to the English coronation, while also including the Anglo-Saxon tradition of the Witan choosing the next ruler, as well as the obvious inclusion of God as William became king on Christmas Day. The rites for the ceremony were also read in English and in French, further cementing the combination of Anglo-Saxon and Norman rites. When King Edward was canonised as a saint in 1161, it legitimised the holiness of the Abbey, securing it as a place for the coronations of future kings and queens. It wouldn't be Edward's only contribution to the coronation ceremony, as a crown thought to date back to his reign, known as St Edward's crown, was used until 1649 to crown the new monarch. But during the English Civil War, it was melted down by the parliamentarians, ending its long period of use. And you may be thinking, wait, what is that crown they're using now then? Well, that's also called St Edward's crown. This one was made in 1661 for the coronation of Charles II, the first constitutional monarch of England and Scotland. While it's not an exact copy, it did take many elements of the original, such as its 4 crosses pâté and 4 fleurs-de-lis, as well as having 2 arches that cross each other. Another element of the coronation is the chair the new monarch sits on, known as King Edward's chair. This wasn't Edward the Confessor, but Edward I, who commissioned the chair in 1296. This would be quite benign, except that it was created to contain the Stone of Scone, the coronation stone captured from Scotland during the First Scottish War of Independence. The history of the Stone of Scone is mired in myth and legend. Some stories say it came from Ireland, while others said it had biblical origins as the Stone of Jacob. Whatever its true origins, the stone was used for centuries for Scottish coronations before Edward stole it away. But why did he take it at all? And why is it in the English coronation chair? For that, we have to look at events preceding its capture. During Edward's early reign, Scotland and England had quite a harmonious existence together, with the Scottish king paying homage to the English king for lands held in England. But everything kicked off when Alexander III of Scotland died in 1286. His only heir was Margaret, Maid of Norway, his 3-year-old granddaughter, born to Alexander's daughter Margaret and King Eric II of Norway. She was eventually sent for at the age of 6 in 1290, and an agreement was put in place that she should first travel to Edward I in England, and then on to Scotland. This was due to the additional agreement that she would marry Edward's son, Edward of Carnarvon. Unfortunately, she fell ill on the ship crossing over and died at Orkney. This led to a succession dispute in Scotland between several claimants, and Edward was invited to come and help settle matters. While Margaret was alive, King Edward hadn't been too concerned about control of Scotland, as after his son Edward and Margaret had children, those children would inherit both kingdoms. Now she was gone, King Edward declared himself Scotland's feudal overlord. For many reasons, the Scottish nobles weren't happy about this, but eventually an agreement was struck that King Edward would remain temporarily in this position, only until a successor could be chosen. Eventually, the magnates settled on John Balliol becoming the next King of Scotland, but to their annoyance, King Edward continued to fulfil many duties that should have been handed over, such as hearing court appeals and asking for Scottish soldiers to fight against France. This was too far, and Scotland instead made an alliance with France, kicking off years of wars between England and Scotland as the Scots attacked Carlisle. Tit for tat went on for some time, with Edward taking Berwick-upon-Tweed in retaliation, until he finally captured the Stone of Scone from Scone Abbey, taking it back to London with him. The stone's significance, therefore, was that King Edward considered himself, and by extension the English monarchs who would come after him, to be the rightful rulers of Scotland. He commissioned the chair from the carpenter Walter of Durham, who made it from oak, decorating it with carvings, gilding and coloured glass, much of which has been lost over the centuries. Originally, monarchs sat directly on the stone itself until the 17th century, when a wooden seat was added over the stone. You may be glad to hear that in 1996, the British government returned the Stone of Scone to Scotland to be part of the Scottish Crown Jewels at Edinburgh, to be brought down to Westminster only for coronations. Some might say it was long overdue. The chair itself received much damage over the years, when tourists in the 18th century could pay to sit on it for a few pennies. They often carved graffiti into the chair, and some even sliced pieces off to keep as a souvenir. For Queen Victoria's Golden Jubilee in 1887, the chair was covered in a layer of brown paint, which later had to be removed by restorers. On the 11th of June 1914, the chair was even subject to a suffragette bombing, when a corner of the chair was broken off and had to later be replaced. Despite all of its tribulations, the chair has so far survived over 8 centuries and is still a part of the British monarch's coronation. After the first monarchs to rule over both Scotland and England, with King James VI and I respectively coming first, 2 coronations would take place. This would be one for the English crown and one for the Scottish crown, and these could be in different places. The Abbey of Scone remained the place for Scottish monarchs to be crowned long after the stone had been removed. But in 1567, the infant James VI was crowned at Stirling. This was likely because of his age, as he was only 13 months old at the time and was being brought up at Stirling Castle. After the 1707 union between England and Scotland, with both now being part of Great Britain, the monarch would thereafter be only crowned at Westminster with a single oath. Even the oath itself was subject to change. For many centuries, the monarch had promised to rule over their people properly and to do God's will, but they hadn't really promised anything along the lines of doing as their government asked. Before the English Civil War, Parliament was almost at the monarch's disposal, simply a tool to acquire more funding through taxes. There was a certain amount of agreement between the two parties if they were smart, but ultimately the monarch had the overarching authority and could dismiss Parliament if they wanted to. After Charles II died in 1685 and was succeeded by his younger brother, James II of England and the 7th of Scotland, many people became anxious about having a Catholic monarch. They were increasingly worried about his religious policies, and this only increased when he and his queen, Mary of Modena, had a son and brought him up Catholic. By June 1688, the Protestant William, Prince of Orange, was invited to come from the Netherlands and take up the British crown. It helped that there was still a connection to previous monarchs, in the form of his wife Mary, James II's daughter. William's mother, known as Mary, Princess Royal, was the sister of Charles I. The movement became known as the Glorious Revolution, and when William arrived at Brixham, not only did he find several English and Scottish exiles there to aid him, but the English army also mostly defected to him, leaving King James to flee with his family. It was agreed by Parliament that Mary and William would rule jointly, but they immediately set about formally limiting their powers and ensuring the new monarchs had to remain Protestant. A new oath was created to be taken by William and Mary and all future monarchs. This one bound the monarchs to agree to abiding by and ruling by laws made in Parliament. They also had to agree to upholding the Reformed Protestant religion. These 2 changes ensured Britain would never have another Catholic monarch, and that the monarch themselves had to answer to the laws agreed upon by Parliament. Mary and William also had to take a Scottish coronation oath in order to hold the Scottish throne when they were invited, but they didn't have a separate Scottish coronation ceremony. After the Union of 1707, in which Scotland joined England, and by extension Wales, which was still considered part of England, and Ireland, which was considered to be subordinate to the English crown, the ruling monarch now became monarch of Great Britain. Even the language of the coronation changed at times to suit what was needed. When James VI of Scotland became James I of England, his entire ceremony was conducted in English. This was partly to reflect the new values of the Protestant Reformation, in which all people of the country should be able to understand religious rites, and also an attempt to connect with an English identity from before the Norman conquest. However, at the 1714 coronation of George I, the first Hanoverian king of Great Britain, the service was conducted in Latin, as it was the only common language between the German-speaking monarch and his clergy. By the time of Elizabeth II's coronation, the ceremony was spoken partly in Latin and mostly in English. These choices show the ceremony as a reflection of the country and the monarch's necessary duties towards religion and the identity of their kingdom. Over the decades from William IV, the British coronation became less lavish. His coronation in 1831 was against the backdrop of economic depression, and he felt it was wrong to spend too much on it. It ended up costing only a sixth of his brother George IV's coronation in 1821. It became known as a half-crown nation by many traditionalists who wanted to see more of the event. William IV wore his robes over his existing Admiral of the Fleet uniform, and the procession on foot from Westminster Hall to Westminster Abbey was replaced in favour of a coach procession from St James's Palace instead. Many of these pared-down elements would be used in future coronations. By the 20th century, parts of the ceremony were moved around in order to show tradition alongside innovation, and the pageantry of the coronation was increased to show the diversity and wealth of the British Empire. This pageantry was still present in Elizabeth II's coronation, as she arrived in a lavishly decorated coach, and much thought was given to her dress and robes. But thinking about the public's opinion of the coronation was nothing new. In 1377, Richard II became the new King of England, but at just 10 years old, it was thought the young king wouldn't be imposing enough to command respect based on his appearance, and so lavish plans were made surrounding his coronation to impress the public spectators. Bands played along the route, wine was poured freely, and a fake castle was even built in Cheapside where a young girl blew gold leaf over the king. Charles II's coronation was so elaborate that Samuel Pepys, a spectator there, later wrote no one could look at it for the gold and silver that shone from the procession. The early modern period saw artists allowed inside the abbey to paint the coronations as they happened. These images often later been published in folio books as engravings for ordinary people to look at. Finally, in 1911 at the coronation of George V, photographs were permitted of some of the elements of the coronation. By 1937, at the coronation of his son George VI, the ceremony was broadcast for the first time across radio by the BBC, as well as the procession to Westminster Abbey being televised on the early BBC television service. Years later in 1953, by the time of Elizabeth II's coronation, the entire ceremony was televised for the public. Originally, only parts of the ceremony were to be filmed, but it was actually Elizabeth's intervention that forced the decision that the whole coronation would instead be visible. Over 20 million people tuned in to view their new queen being crowned. However, for all the tradition that has passed down in the ceremony, it is conspicuous for being the coronation of the British monarch, and yet holding little to no elements from Wales or Ireland. The absence of traditions from these proud nations, Ireland later becoming Ireland and Northern Ireland respectively, speaks loudly of the shadowy past of Great Britain, in which Wales was simply seen as another part of England, and Ireland as a subdued nation which had to bow to the English crown. While the wounds caused by history's chasms can take a long time to heal, the modern coronation of Charles III has made some way towards this, with parts of the ceremony spoken not only in English, but also in Scottish Gaelic, Irish Gaelic and Welsh. Whatever shape future coronations take, or if Britain even has another one, we can only hope the bonds between these four countries remain and grow stronger. The British coronation has come a long way since King Edgar and Queen Aelfthryth first sat in Bath Abbey to be crowned as the legitimate rulers of England, but it still retains elements of each coronation that has come since. It has been used to legitimise a monarch's rule, to create connections between countries, and to impress the public watching and judging the actions of their new king or queen. The origins of the British coronation can therefore ultimately be seen not only as elements of a regal ceremony, but as a story telling the history of how Britain defined itself and its people. If you enjoyed this video, don't forget to like and subscribe so you don't miss any new documentaries.